Hey everyone, Mr. Drake here. As we begin looking at political participation in AP government, this video is designed to give you a brief history of voting in the United States. By the time this video is over, you should be able to identify groups to whom suffrage has been extended in the history of the United States, and when that occurred. Also, you should be able to explain why some groups still had difficulty voting even when they were legally permitted to do so on a technical basis. Also, describe the effect of extending suffrage on actual electoral results. And define those terms. They're listed: Jacksonian democracy, the amendments that address voting rights, and obstacles to black suffrage. The franchise, or the right to vote, has been extended in a big way 4 times in America's history. First to non-landholders, people who did not own property, then to blacks, then to women, then people between the ages of 18 and 20. And in this video, we're going to look at why and how voting rights were extended to each of these groups. In most states before the 1820s, the only people who were allowed to vote were white men who owned property. This was because the founders of the country, the framers of the Constitution, really did not intend for much of a popular vote. They thought that most people were uneducated, stupid, and didn't have the best interests of the country in mind. So they limited political influence to those at the top, the people who were well educated, fairly well off, and had power and influence. That began to change in the 1820s with the emergence of Andrew Jackson, the 7th President of the United States, who began to usher in what he called the era of the common man. This is known today as Jacksonian democracy, referring in general to the increase in influence of people who were not wealthy. And during the 1800s, the early 1800s, states began to gradually eliminate property ownership requirements for actually being able to vote. And by about the time of the Civil War in 1860, all of those requirements had been eliminated, giving non-property owners the right to vote. The fight for black voting rights is the longest and most contentious battle related to voting in America's history. The Civil War ends in 1865, and at that time the 13th Amendment was passed and ratified, which banned slavery. The 14th Amendment then granted citizenship to anyone born in the United States and granted them equal protection before the law. The 15th Amendment was finally passed in 1870, which said that no man could be denied voting based on his race, thereby granting African Americans, at least in theory, the right to vote. Of course, that does not actually occur in the way that the people who wrote the amendment thought that it would. The southern United States, the former Confederacy during the Civil War, was occupied from 1865 to 1877 in an era known as Reconstruction. The South ceased to be occupied in 1877, and at that time, the people who had been in power before the Civil War sort of resumed their power and influence in those states. And they began to find ways to get around granting African Americans the right to vote and other rights in Southern society as well. Some of those ways are listed here. One is a literacy test that had to be passed in order to be able to vote. The problem there is many blacks at this time were former slaves, and they had never been taught how to read. So the literacy test essentially disfranchised those people. Poll taxes were also put in place, and you see on this slide a picture of a poll tax receipt from Louisiana around the time of World War I. Poll taxes were only about $1 or $2, but of course adjusted for inflation, that was more like $25, $30 now. And most blacks who were poor sharecroppers in the South really couldn't spare that and couldn't afford to pay it. Now, the way around the literacy test for some poor white people who couldn't read was the grandfather clause. The grandfather clause stated that if your ancestors voted before, say, 1865, you did not have to pass the literacy test or pay a poll tax in order to be able to vote. Of course, black people's ancestors before 1865 were slaves who couldn't vote, so they were the ones who had to do the literacy test and the poll tax. Also, in many southern states, white primaries existed where blacks were not allowed to take part in any kind of primary election. So, as you can see here, even though blacks, according to the Constitution, had voting rights, southern states found a way to keep them from exercising their right. Gradually, most of these restrictions were done away with. The grandfather clause was done away with in 1915 by the Supreme Court case Gwynne versus the United States, and then Smith versus Allwright in 1944 declared the white primary unconstitutional. In 1964, the 24th Amendment to the Constitution was passed, which banned the use of poll taxes in federal elections. Poll taxes were also later banned in state and local elections. And then the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which was a very seminal piece of legislation signed by President Lyndon Johnson, authorized the government to oversee elections in areas with a history of racial discrimination. And you guessed it, that's mostly the southern United States. So you begin to see the few remaining literacy tests eliminated, and the government overseeing registration of black voters to ensure that they had that right. Women's suffrage, the push for that begins in the time before the Civil War, really. The Seneca Falls Convention in 1848 was a meeting of women's rights leaders demanding certain additional privileges to what they already had, including the right to vote. In 1869, Wyoming became the first U.S. territory to allow all women the right to vote, and Wyoming, to this day, is known as the Equality State. By about 1900, most western states and territories had given women the right to vote. This was for several reasons. One, they were trying to attract people to move out west, these territories were, and they were able to sell women on moving out to this uninhabited area by saying, hey, look, you can vote. You have equal rights if you come out here. Also, women had a very large role in Western society. They worked hard. They did not work necessarily in the home. They had a higher status in cities and in societies out west. And so women were given right to vote much more easily out west. World War I gave women a lot of motivation to push for voting rights because Woodrow Wilson and the U.S. government sort of couched World War I or framed it as a war for democracy, and women in the United States were like, whoa, 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 whoa. How can we fight for democracy in Europe and the world over if there is half of the population in the United States that still doesn't have full democratic rights, i.e. the right to vote? And you see an example of that on the left there with Alice Paul, a very famous women's suffrage activist, holding a sign accusing Woodrow Wilson of being no better than the Kaiser of Germany. So, them's fighting words. And then finally, in 1920, the 19th Amendment is ratified, which gives women nationwide the right to vote. 18 to 20-year-olds is the last group we'll address here. The right to vote for 18 to 20-year-olds was really spearheaded by the Vietnam War. The people that were pushing for this made a fairly valid point that people who could be drafted into the army and sent to die for their country should be allowed to vote for the commander-in-chief that was sending them to fight and die for their country. So in 1970, there was a Voting Rights Act passed that gave people from 18 to 20 the right to vote in federal elections. It did not apply to state and local elections, but once the 26th Amendment was passed in 1971, all elections nationwide had to allow 18-year-olds, 19-year-olds, and 20-year-olds the right to vote. Finally, let's take a look at what impact these changes actually had. The property ownership requirement being eliminated led to candidates campaigning more publicly and led to more of an appeal to the common man. This is where you begin to see candidates saying, hey, I'm just like you, instead of just having these elites running who only cater to the wealthy, the well-placed, and people, who previously were the only ones allowed to vote. Black suffrage, again, while it was technically in place, did not exist in practice well into the 20th century. It led to a lot of resentment towards blacks. Southerners who were upset about the way the Civil War had gone and the end of slavery were in no mood to allow blacks the right to vote. Literacy tests, grandfather clauses, the things we talked about. And if those didn't work, there was just intimidation of blacks and basically threatening them out of actually voting. But after 1965, with the passage of the Voting Rights Act, which we'll talk more about in this class, you begin to see politicians appealing more to the blacks as a large voting bloc. Women and 18 to 20-year-olds being allowed to vote did not, at least in the short term, have a huge effect on the results of elections. Women often voted the same way their husbands did, so you don't see a big shift in public opinion there. And young voters don't typically go vote. In the 1994 congressional elections, this is the one stat I've seen as I was making this video, 1 out of 5 people under the age of 24 went and voted. So there is not a whole lot of motivation for politicians to cater to the youth vote since they just don't participate. Now, one thing you'll see politicians do, though, is try to get young people out to vote, especially Democrats, as many young voters align themselves with the Democratic Party. Barack Obama in 2008 and 2012, for example, made a big point of going after the youth vote, and those young voters were a big part of him winning election to the presidency twice. That will do it for today. As always, be sure to review this video for tests and the AP exam and for quizzes and all of that, and ask your teacher if you've got any questions. Cheers!